Hello once again, and welcome back to our series on the Daedric princes of the Elder Scrolls. Today we'll be covering the Lady of Light herself, Meridia, as well as Athalia, and if you don't know who Athalia is, well, you're sure gonna find out, but of course a little housekeeping first. As always, we'll be going through the lore as it appears in game release orders, so you can see how things were built up and changed over the years. This being the case, Athalia won't be showing up until the Elder Scrolls Online section towards the end of the video. And of course, as always, this is mainly an audio focused experience, so feel free to put it on in the background. Now then, remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get started. As we often do, we begin in Daggerfall. Things are relatively simple here. We summon Meridia on her summoning day, the 13th of Morningstar, and she gives us a quest to defeat a sorcerer that has wronged her. What's notable about this exchange is that despite telling you to murder someone, and indeed threatening you if you refuse, her tone is always friendly, which is indicative of Meridia as a whole, really, this Lady of Light who appears benevolent and kind, but really still just sees mortal as tools to be used for her will. But back to Daggerfall. Upon completion of the quest, as you do in Daggerfall, you meet a servant of Meridia and they give you your reward. This time being the Ring of Khajiit, or just the Ring of Khajiit as it's called here. What's interesting about this artifact in particular is that it isn't just associated with Meridia, it is also associated with Mephala, a prince we have yet to cover in this series. Now, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why Meridia has any claim to the ring. It was first possessed by Mephala until it was stolen by Rajin, the thief god of the Khajiit. Rajin would use the ring to become arguably the greatest thief who ever lived, going so far as to steal a tattoo from the Empress Kintyra. He even used it to steal other Daedric artifacts such as the Ogma Infinium, but eventually it would go the way of Gollum and the One Ring on him and abandon him. But that's more or less all we have for Daggerfall, so moving on. Before we get to our next game, however, there is a book I want to mention that refers to the events that take place at the end of Daggerfall. This book does come from ESO, so this is a little out of order, but it is relevant not only for Meridia, but for our discussions on Athalia later. Now, to explain the excerpt from this book, we need to explain Meridia's origins. Now, according to Michael Kirkbride, in what was technically never official canon, but has since been confirmed to be the case, Meridia was once a solar daughter, one of the daughters of the god Magnus. These beings are typically referred to as the Magna G. Meridia was said to have been cast out for consorting with illicit spectra. What that actually means is unknown, but considering she managed to become a Daedric prince, I would assume it means she was consorting with Daedra. Anyway, back to this book, The Nine Coruscations. This book states that Meridia, known within the Magna G as the Red Star, because the Magna G are all named stars as Magnus himself is the sun, she shines most brightly during dragon breaks. That might seem vague and irrelevant, but keep it in the back of your mind, it'll show up again later. Meridia is one of the princes who doesn't really appear in Morrowind outside of books like Tamrielic lore, which talk about the aforementioned Ring of Khajiit among other artifacts, so we'll be jumping straight to Oblivion. Meridia has an image of being a goddess of light. She is known as the Sunfire, the Bright Lady, and the Radiant One, among many other titles, and it gives this image of being benevolent and kind. She's even known as the Prince of Life. But her sphere of influence is said to be obscured, which is just one more thing that makes this image she's created for herself seem a little suspicious. So why am I talking about this now? Well, in Oblivion, Meridia has two quests, sort of, and they both reinforce this theme to an extent. Meridia, at her shrine, will speak to the player when given an offering of some kind of ingredient from an undead creature. The player will then be sent to exterminate necromancers. Meridia is said to loathe the undead, deeming them an affront to life. So, of course, you defeat these necromancers and are once again given the Ring of Khajiit. This is all fairly par for the course, but we learn more about Meridia in the Knights of the Nine DLC. Meridia's champion, Umaril the Unfeathered, acts as the story's antagonist. And this is where we're going to get really into why Meridia isn't actually a force for good at all. Umaril the Unfeathered was an Ayleid, a Heartland elf, the previous rulers of Cyrodiil. Many of the Ayleid cities were known to practice Daedra worship, and in that respect, Meridia does make perfect sense, given that she was a Magna-G and the Ayleids used starlight as a primary source of power. Of course, not all of them worshipped Meridia, some even worshipped more like Baal, and there was a great deal of conflict there. The Ayleids are typically remembered as a cruel race, as slavers and torturers, and those things they certainly were. This was, after all, the entire basis of the Elysian Slave Rebellion that had Umaril the Unfeathered fighting against Pelennor Whitestreak. But, of course, you can argue that a god is not responsible for the actions of the race that worships them. However, let's look more closely at Umaril and Meridia herself. Meridia possesses the ability to grant immortality to mortals, generally known as the Purified. This, however, is in exchange for their free will. This isn't only to her followers, however, she has been known to do this to those who defy her also. Meridia, much like the Ayleids and of course Umaril, is essentially a slaver. She is seen as good and benevolent, and she presents herself with an aesthetic of gold and wings and light, and her hatred of undead is often looked upon favorably too. But when you look at her actions, she's no more just or good than any of the other Daedric princes. But now moving on to Skyrim. In Skyrim, you can either go to Meridia's temple, where she will tell you to go and find her beacon, or you can just find it when you're at the appropriate level. I'm not going to play the voice line, I'm not that cruel. Once you have the beacon, however, you will be instructed to enter her temple on Mount Kilcreath and, surprise surprise, defeat a necromancer. This necromancer was using an artifact of Meridia's to aid in his necromancy, and that artifact, Dawnbreaker, is our reward. Dawnbreaker is the embodiment of the prince's hatred for the undead, being forged especially for the task, and thus is incredibly effective against them. But despite Dawnbreaker being one of the coolest Daedric artifacts, it doesn't actually have very much lore to it, given that it was introduced in Skyrim. But it does feature in the Elder Scrolls Online, our next destination. A lot of Meridia's major actions in this game are things we've already covered, mainly when talking about Nocturnal, so we won't be repeating anything here. Aside from the fact that Nocturnal manages to turn Dawnbreaker into Duskbringer, which does something, I guess, briefly, before it gets turned back into Dawnbreaker again. Anyway, Meridia does have the advantage of being featured quite prominently in the main quest the game launched with. Back in the first era, there existed a city that was devoted to Meridia. The city was then invaded by minions of Molag Bal who had appeared through a portal. Meridia saw this as an opportunity, however. She used this portal to force the city into Molag Bal's realm of Coldharbour. This really demonstrates just how powerful she is, as the city, even within Molag Bal's own realm, was immune to him and his forces. This is relevant as when we have to invade Coldharbour to stop the events of the Plain Meld, which we'll talk about when we get to Molag Bal, this is where we are able to gain a foothold. Meridia, of course, being all too happy to help those who oppose her enemy. Even going so far as to not only aid in the fight, but to even save the Vestige, the protagonist, by rescuing their soul after Molag Bal is defeated and taking it to her realm, the Coloured Rooms. Little is known about the coloured rooms, but apparently has sections that look like coral reefs and sections with floating stones, and as the name would suggest, is said to be very colourful with a red sky and multicoloured clouds. Apparently it's also very boring, and apparently on occasion they get lectured by Meridia, which is also apparently boring. But another thing ESO introduces to us is the prismatic core, a crystal that was created through followers of Meridia being sacrificed. This crystal would then be used to create a prismatic weapon, though what kind of weapon ended up being forged is in the hands of the player, and so is unknown. But now let's get onto our other subject for this video, Athalia. To go over things briefly, Athalia is a prince introduced in the Elder Scrolls Online, said to be the prince of changing fate and alternate paths. Essentially, she can influence and alter fate and affect different choices and outcomes of events. However, she was deemed such a threat by Hermaeus Mora, who thought her power would unravel existence, that he convinced his fellow princes to remove her from history, getting rid of all traces of her from memory. And at the end of her questline, after she manages to return, she's banished and all memory of her is erased again, because she ends up agreeing with Mora. Now you might be thinking that all sounds pretty pointless. Anyway, the reason I bring Athalia up in this video is because she also originated as a Magna G, just like Meridia, so they're sort of sisters. And it still sort of baffles me that someone made this decision. I mean, you get to create a brand new Daedric prince, and you just give them the same backstory as an existing one? And then basically make her non-canon even within the context of your own game? It's just weird. Because until Elder Scrolls 6 comes out, assuming she's in it at all, she's completely irrelevant to the lore. Hermaeus Mora knows she exists, but that's about it. But yeah, I was never going to do a whole video in this series about Athalia, so I figured I would just include it here. I just really don't understand this character from a creative standpoint, because they're just completely irrelevant. There's some cool ideas with a character like that, like seeing the flaws in Akatosh and whatnot, which connects to Meridia again, as we said at the start of the video, she shines most brightly during Dragon Breaks. But I think you need to completely rework the design, the backstory, and the reason she's included at all, because as of right now, if she was never created, never written, never existed in the game, the only thing that would be different is that this video would be over already. Also, her realm is called Mirrormore, just for completion's sake. But back to Meridia, the Lady of Light. As we've learned through this video, she is not the purely good force she pretends to be. She despises free will, she is self-righteous and quick to anger, but in the grand scheme of things, she's certainly not the worst prince to worship. You might even end up immortal if you don't mind becoming a slave to her every whim. Also, there's a book in ESO where one of the Daedra refers to her as the Shining Bitch, and I just thought that was funny. But anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time.